In the darkness of her home, Sophie's life had become a never-ending nightmare. The sound of glass shattering followed by the sting of her husband's violent hand across her cheek was all too familiar. John, once a man who vowed to protect her, had become the very thing she feared the most. Her small daughter Ella stood in the hallway wide-eyed, frozen in terror, witnessing the brutality she could neither understand nor escape. The rage in John's eyes was enough to chill anyone to the bone, but it was the words that followed, "You brought this on yourself," that cut the deepest. Sophie's life had been reduced to nothing more than a series of bruises, both visible and hidden. Each night she would stare into the mirror, tracing the marks left on her face, the wounds that told the story of her isolation and emotional destruction. The woman she once was had been slowly erased by years of fear and control. The first time John grabbed her wrist, leaving a bruise, she had believed his apology. But now there were no more apologies, only silence. An oppressive silence that smothered any hope of change. She had tried to ignore the constant whispers of self-doubt, the nagging feeling that maybe it was all her fault. But that night, when Ella screamed and tried to protect her, Sophie knew she had no choice. She had to leave for her own survival and for her daughter. With her heart pounding, she packed only the essentials, knowing that the hardest part was not leaving, but finding the courage to escape the cage she had lived in for so long. After another violent outburst, Sophie knew she could not stay. The pain was unbearable. Not just the physical wounds, but the crushing weight of living in constant fear. For years she had endured John's cruelty, convinced that things would change, that he would keep his promises. But those promises had long since turned to dust. Each apology was a lie. Each "I'm sorry," followed by another round of abuse. And as much as she wanted to believe he would change deep down, she knew he never would. That night, after the storm of anger had subsided and John passed out in his study, Sophie stood in the bathroom staring at the face she barely recognized. The fluorescent lights above flickered as she traced the purple bruise along her jaw. The blood at the corner of her mouth had dried, but the wound that hurt the most was hidden deep within. The isolation, the threats, the constant erosion of her spirit. It was all too much to bear, but there was something different this time. Something inside her had snapped. She couldn't take it anymore. She could no longer pretend that everything would be okay. She couldn't wait for him to change because she knew he never would. And most importantly, she couldn't let her daughter Ella grow up thinking that this was what love looked like, that this was how relationships were supposed to be. Sophie took a deep breath, her hand trembling as she wiped away the tears that had begun to fall. She could hear Ella's soft breathing from the other room, and it broke her heart knowing that her daughter had witnessed so much pain. But it also gave her the strength she needed to leave. She couldn't stay for her own sake, but for Ella, she had to leave. For the little girl who deserved more than a life filled with fear and suffering. She moved quietly through the house, her bare feet making almost no sound on the hardwood floors. Every creak in the stairs made her heart race. She packed quickly, shoving clothes into a small duffel bag, grabbing a few essentials clothes for Ella, her passport, a prepaid phone tucked away in a shoebox behind her closet. She didn't have time to think, to second-guess herself. The fear of being caught, of John waking up and realizing what she was doing, weighed heavily on her. But it was nothing compared to the terror of staying. In the stillness of the night, she crept into Ella's room, watching her daughter sleep peacefully, unaware of the chaos that had become their lives. Sophie leaned over her, whispering softly, "Sweetheart, we're going on a little adventure." The words felt foreign on her tongue, but they were the promise of a new life. A life where Ella would not have to witness the horrors of their current reality. Sophie buckled Ella into the back seat of the car, her hands trembling as she started the engine. She didn't look back at the house. The house that had once been their home now felt like a prison. As the car sped through the empty streets, her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Her original plan had been to drive to her sister's house in Oregon, but the fear that John would track her down made her second-guess everything. She couldn't risk it. So she made a snap decision. She would fly. At the airport, with only a few dollars to her name, Sophie paid cash for a ticket, clutching Ella's hand tightly in hers. The attendant handed her a boarding pass for the next available flight. Gate C-23. Sophie didn't ask where it was going. She didn't care. All that mattered was getting away. She couldn't afford to hesitate. The plane was her escape. Her chance to start over. When the boarding gate opened, Sophie tightened her grip on Ella's hand and boarded the plane. Her heart pounding with fear, but also with the flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she was finally free. Free from the abuse, free from the chains that had bound her for so long. She didn't know where the plane was taking them, but as long as they were leaving the life they knew behind, it was enough. As Sophie hurried through the airport, her heart pounded in her chest, each beat reminding her that she was running from a life that had nearly destroyed her. She clutched Ella's hand tightly, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She hadn't planned on taking a flight, but after considering how dangerous it would be to drive, she knew it was her only chance to escape. She approached the gate, desperate to leave as quickly as possible, hoping that the plane would take her to a safe place far away from John's reach. The attendant at the desk handed her the only remaining ticket, and Sophie barely glanced at the boarding pass before she hurriedly made her way to the gate. Ella was sleepy, clinging to her mother as if sensing the tension in the air. They settled into their seats, and Sophie tucked the blanket around her daughter's small frame, her mind still racing. She hadn't allowed herself to stop and think about the consequences of her actions. What would happen if John found out? What if he tracked her down? Her breath hitched as she imagined him hunting her down every moment, feeling like a countdown to the inevitable discovery. As the plane began to taxi, Sophie stole a glance at the boarding pass, only to realize that she had made a critical mistake. The flight wasn't going to Oregon as she had thought. The ticket read Colorado Springs, a place she had never intended to go. Panic surged through her, but she couldn't back out now. She was already on the plane, too far from the gate to change her mind. She had no time to reconsider, no time to make another decision. Her mind screamed at her to go back to get off the plane and find another way to escape. But the fear of being caught, of John tracking her down, paralyzed her. She thought about turning to the flight attendant and asking about the possibility of changing her seat or flight, but she knew it would take too long. The time it would take to explain her mistake might be enough for someone to find her. John could already be looking for her. No, the decision had been made. She was already in the air, and leaving now could only make things worse. The weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on her chest as the plane lifted off the ground. The cabin lights dimmed and the steady hum of the engines became a constant backdrop to her swirling thoughts. She turned to Ella, whose eyes were now fluttering closed, unaware of the mistake Sophie had made. Sophie's grip tightened around her daughter's tiny hand, hoping that somehow they would both be safe in the end. Sitting there in the cramped seat of a plane headed for an unknown destination, Sophie realized how far she had come from the life she once knew. Everything had changed in a moment. She had no idea where she was headed, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt the flicker of hope. She wasn't certain about her future, but the one thing she was sure of was that she had left John behind, and that in itself was enough for now. As the plane soared higher, Sophie closed her eyes and allowed herself a brief moment of relief. She had made it this far, and no matter where this plane would take her, it was a step toward freedom, even if she had boarded the wrong flight. As the plane cruised through the sky, Sophie tried to quiet the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. The low hum of the engines was almost soothing, but the weight of her decision, the fear of what awaited her, and the uncertainty of her future made it hard to settle. She looked down at Ella, who had finally drifted off to sleep against the window, her small face peaceful and unaware of the chaos that had driven them to this moment. Sophie tucked the blanket around her daughter more securely, her thoughts heavy with regret and hope in equal measure. Just as Sophie tried to gather herself, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, can I sit here?" The words were calm, almost weary, and Sophie looked up startled. The man who had spoken was tall, probably in his mid-30s, dressed in a simple gray sweater and jeans with slightly tousled hair, as though he had run his hands through it too many times. There was something unassuming about him, yet there was a quiet intensity in his eyes that made Sophie pause. For a moment she hesitated. The flight was full, and she had carefully chosen her seat to avoid any unnecessary attention to hide in the shadows. But something in his expression, his tone, made her feel less threatened. Without a word, she shifted to give him room. "Of course," she murmured, feeling the weight of his presence beside her. He settled into the seat beside her, his leather carry-on bag neatly placed under the seat in front of him. For a few minutes there was only the sound of the plane and Ella's soft breathing. Sophie adjusted her scarf, pulling it higher to cover the bruise on her cheek, a habit that had become second nature over the years. The man didn't ask questions, didn't pry, but Sophie could feel his awareness, as if he knew there was something more behind the quiet woman beside him. His gaze, however, didn't linger on her, instead focused on the tray table in front of him, his expression unreadable. Sophie, still unsure of her own emotions, glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. He wasn't staring at her with pity or curiosity. There was just a quiet understanding in the way he held himself, as if he recognized pain without needing to ask for the details. It was a strange comfort, something Sophie hadn't realized she needed until that moment. After a while, the silence between them felt less awkward and more like a shared space of unspoken understanding. The man who had remained silent until now finally spoke. "You're traveling alone." His voice was low, gentle, not intrusive, and it caught Sophie off guard. She met his eyes briefly, then looked away, unsure of how to answer. "Yeah," she replied softly, her voice almost drowned by the hum of the plane, sort of. He nodded, a slight understanding smile pulling at the corners of his lips. "She's your daughter?" he asked, glancing at Ella, still asleep beside her. His tone was soft, kind, and Sophie felt a flicker of warmth, a relief in knowing that he didn't see her as some broken woman, but as someone who was simply living through a difficult moment. "Yes," Sophie replied, her voice trembling just slightly. "Her name is Ella. She's 5. James didn't respond right away, but the way he looked at her, his gaze steady without pity, but filled with a quiet empathy, left Sophie feeling both seen and unseen at the same time. His next words were gentle, almost a whisper. "She sleeps like someone who knows she's safe." The simple truth of it hit Sophie harder than she expected. She felt a lump rise in her throat as she looked at her daughter, her heart aching with the desire to protect Ella from the horrors that had once been their reality. Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to focus on the present. "I hope so," she whispered, her voice barely audible. In that moment she realized that it wasn't just about escaping her past. It was about making sure that Ella could finally feel safe, that she could give her daughter a life free from fear. And for the first time in a long time, Sophie allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were on their way to something better. James didn't press her for more. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment as if he understood the weight of the silence that hung between them. Sophie turned to look out the window, her thoughts still swirling, but for the first time in a long time there was a sense of calm. The man beside her, a stranger, had somehow given her that calm without even trying. When the plane finally touched down, the overwhelming weight of reality hit Sophie harder than she had anticipated. The flight, which had once felt like a lifeline, now felt like a bridge to nowhere. As passengers disembarked and hurried past her, Sophie stood frozen in the terminal, unsure of what to do next. She had no plan, no destination, just the lingering uncertainty of a future she hadn't been able to envision. Her phone had died, and with no way of contacting her sister in Oregon, Sophie felt more alone than ever. Ella stirred beside her, rubbing her eyes as the world around them buzzed with movement. Sophie could hear the chatter of families reuniting, friends embracing, and the familiar hum of everyday life, moving on without them. She felt out of place, like a ghost in the midst of the living. For a moment she considered leaving the airport, but where would she go? The night had already fallen, and Sophie knew the city would not be kind to them. She couldn't risk being exposed, couldn't let her guard down for even a second. That's when she felt the presence beside her again. James, the man who had shared her silence during the flight, appeared beside her, his coat wrapped around his shoulders, as he looked at her with a quiet, unspoken understanding. His eyes were kind but serious, and as he took in her uncertain expression, he spoke softly. "Are you waiting for someone?" Sophie's lips parted, then closed again. She was about to tell him she was fine, that she would figure it out on her own, but the exhaustion, both physical and emotional, made her words falter. She shook her head, unsure of what to say. It felt wrong to admit that she had no plan, that she had no idea what came next. James studied her for a moment, then his voice broke through the weight of her silence. "If you don't have anywhere to go, I know a place. It's not far. Just about an hour's drive. A farm. Quiet, secluded. No one knows about it. You and your daughter could stay there at least until you figure things out." His words were calm, matter of fact, as though offering shelter to a stranger was just something he did. Sophie looked at him, skepticism rising. Why would he offer that to a complete stranger? What did he want in return? She studied him carefully, trying to gauge his intentions. But there was nothing in his demeanor that suggested anything but genuine kindness. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He wasn't pushing her to take the offer, just stating the facts. I don't know," Sophie stammered, her mind racing. She wanted to trust him, but she had learned the hard way that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. Yet as she glanced down at Ella, still rubbing her sleepy eyes, Sophie knew she couldn't keep wandering through the world lost and unprotected. James seemed to understand her hesitation. He met her gaze, his eyes soft yet firm. "I've been a stranger needing shelter before. Someone help me. I'm just passing it on." The simplicity of his words struck Sophie, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt the possibility of safety. She thought about Ella, about how she had clung to her mother's side all night, how she deserved more than fear and confusion. Sophie took a slow breath, weighing her options. Finally, with a quiet nod, she whispered, "Okay." James didn't say anything more. He simply turned and led them out of the terminal. The drive was long and quiet. The only sound the low hum of the engine and the occasional soft murmur from Ella, who had fallen asleep once again. As they drove through winding back roads, the city lights fading behind them, Sophie couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace wash over her. For the first time since she had left her old life behind, she felt like she was going to be okay, like she had a chance to rebuild, to breathe, and to finally give Ella the safe future she deserved. The farmhouse was quiet, tucked away in a secluded corner of the world, far from the chaos Sophie had left behind. It was a far cry from the life she had known, but in its simplicity, it offered something she hadn't felt in years: safety. James led her and Ella inside, offering them more than just a roof over their heads. He gave them peace, a peace that had been sorely lacking in Sophie's life. The soft glow of the farmhouse, the smell of fresh earth and pine, and the gentle hum of the stove as James prepared tea. It was all so foreign to Sophie, yet comforting in a way she couldn't explain. James didn't ask many questions. He didn't push her to talk about her past, understanding that some stories needed time before they could be told. He simply did what he could to make them feel at home. He carried Ella inside, careful not to disturb her, as she slept soundly wrapped in the blanket Sophie had tucked around her. He showed Sophie to the guest room where clean sheets and a cozy quilt awaited. There was no judgment in his eyes, no curiosity, just quiet kindness. The first few days at the farm were filled with silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence shared by two people who understood the weight of their pasts, who didn't need to fill every moment with words. Sophie found herself sitting by the fire staring into the flames while James busied himself with simple tasks, tending to the garden, fixing the creaky floorboards, making sure there was food on the table. He didn't push her to talk, but he didn't shy away from offering comfort either. Every small gesture, from the tea he made in the morning to the way he would quietly check on them before heading to bed, made Sophie feel seen for the first time in a long time. Gradually, Sophie began to open up. It started with little things, telling James about Ella's favorite blanket, the way she hummed to herself when she was happy, or the way she would curl up in Sophie's lap when she was scared. James listened with rapt attention, nodding along as if he truly cared about the details of her life. And then, little by little, Sophie began to share more about her past, about the abuse, the fear that had haunted her for years. She talked about the loneliness she had felt, the moments when she had convinced herself that she was worthless, that she deserved the pain John had inflicted on her. To her surprise, James didn't flinch or look away. Instead, he listened without interruption, his expression steady, compassionate. He didn't try to fix everything or offer platitudes. He simply acknowledged her pain, understanding it in a way that was almost unnerving. It was as though he had lived through something similar, as though he had known what it felt like to be broken and lost. One evening, as they sat on the back porch watching the sunset together, Sophie found herself looking at James in a new light. He was no longer just the man who had offered them refuge. He was someone who understood her, someone who had faced his own demons and chosen to live through them, not around them. She could see it in the quiet sadness in his eyes and the way he moved through life with a careful calm that spoke of deep pain. "You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready," James said one night, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "But I just want you to know, I understand. You're not alone here." Sophie's throat tightened as she looked at him, realizing that for the first time in years, she felt truly safe. She wasn't just hiding in a place where she could escape her past. She was in a space where she could finally begin to heal, where she could find the strength to move forward. James's presence, his quiet empathy, had given her something she hadn't known she was missing: a sense of belonging. Here in this quiet farmhouse, Sophie began to believe that she could rebuild her life, that she could let go of the fear and pain that had held her captive for so long. And it was all thanks to the unexpected kindness of a stranger who, like her, had once been broken, but had found a way to heal. Once Sophie had found some stability in her new life at the farmhouse, she began to feel something she hadn't in a long time: a sense of purpose. The quiet days she had spent recovering surrounded by the peaceful countryside and James's unspoken support had given her the space to heal. But healing alone wasn't enough. Sophie knew that in order to fully reclaim her life, she had to do more than just survive. She needed to contribute to help others like herself who had suffered in silence. It was James who first suggested she visit the local women's shelter. At first Sophie hesitated. The thought of speaking about her past, of reliving the horrors of her marriage, made her stomach churn. But James was patient, understanding, and he never pushed her. He simply said, "You have a story that could help others, and you're not alone in this anymore." His words, though simple, resonated deeply with Sophie. She realized he was right. By keeping her story to herself, she wasn't doing justice to the strength she had found. She had to share it to show other women that there was hope, that life after abuse could be rebuilt. So Sophie began volunteering at the shelter, offering her time to help other women who had experienced the same pain and fear. At first, she started small, helping organize supplies, cleaning the rooms, and reading stories to the children while their mothers spoke with counselors. But as time passed, word began to spread about Sophie's courage. The other women were drawn to her not just because she was a survivor, but because of the quiet strength in her eyes. They listened as she shared bits of her own journey, not for sympathy, but to give them hope. Some women cried when they heard her story. Others nodded with recognition, and a few even found the courage to begin sharing their own. One afternoon, after leading a small support group for women who had fled abusive relationships, Sophie found herself sitting in a quiet corner, exhausted but content. The group had been small, just a few women, but she had seen the change in their eyes. They had listened to her, absorbed her words, and they were beginning to believe that they too could escape their pasts. Sophie realized that this helping others was where her strength truly lay. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living. It was about finding the courage to move forward, to build something new, and to show others that they didn't have to live in fear. As Sophie worked with the women at the shelter, she began to recognize her own healing in theirs. Every time she shared her story, it was like another piece of her past fell away, no longer holding her back, but propelling her forward. Sophie knew she had come a long way from the broken woman who had once thought she would never escape. But now, as she stood in front of a group of women sharing her journey of survival, she realized that she had found something more powerful than just freedom. She had found her voice, and through it, she had begun to help others find theirs, in helping them heal. Sophie found her own strength, and for the first time in years, a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. And in turn, she was helping others do the same. One afternoon, as Sophie was sorting through donated clothes at the shelter, a staff member approached her with a small envelope in hand. "This came for you," the volunteer said gently, handing her the letter with no return address. Sophie took it, curious but unsure. She had never expected anything like this. No one had ever sent her anything at the shelter before. She opened it slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled out a single sheet of lined paper. The handwriting was neat, but uneven, as though the writer had carefully thought each word through before putting it on paper. Sophie's heart skipped a beat as she began to read. "Dear Sophie, you don't know me, but I know your story. I was in group 2 months ago, sitting in the back. You didn't see me cry, but I did. I never told anyone before about the things my husband did to me. I thought I had to stay. I thought it was too late. But after hearing you speak, I made a plan. I waited until he was at work, and I took my son and I left. We're in another shelter now. It's not easy, but we're safe. I wanted you to know that. Thank you for being brave. First because of you. I believed I could be brave too." Sophie read the letter 3 times, her eyes filling with tears each time. The words, simple yet profound, hit her harder than she expected. She had never imagined that her own story, her pain and her survival, could have such an impact. She had shared her journey not for accolades or sympathy, but because she wanted others to know that escape was possible, that life after abuse could be rebuilt. Yet in that moment, she realized that by sharing her truth, she had lit a spark in someone else, someone who had felt just as lost, just as powerless as she had once felt. She sat down on the edge of the bench, clutching the letter in her hands as the tears fell freely. It wasn't just the letter that made her cry. It was the realization that she had made a difference. Her courage had inspired someone else to take that first terrifying step toward freedom. She had helped someone else escape the same cycle of fear and isolation she had lived through for so long. The letter gave Sophie more than just emotional validation. It gave her strength. It reminded her why she had chosen to share her story in the first place. It wasn't about personal recognition. It was about showing others that there was hope, that they weren't alone, that they could escape the cycle of abuse and rebuild their lives. This was why she had survived. This was why she had kept going even when everything seemed hopeless. Sophie felt a renewed sense of purpose. The pain she had endured was no longer just her burden to carry. It had become a beacon for others who needed to see that a way out was possible. She carefully folded the letter, tucking it into her pocket, and stood up with a newfound resolve. There was still so much work to do. There were more women who needed to hear that they could leave, that they could be free, that they could start over. And Sophie knew with a certainty she hadn't felt in years that she would continue to be there for them, just as others had been there for her. That evening, as Sophie sat by the fire, she thought about the woman who had written her the letter. Her heart swelled with gratitude. The letter had given her something she hadn't realized she was missing. A reminder that her journey, her story had power. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments there was light, there was hope. And as long as she could, she would continue to be that light for others. A year had passed since Sophie and Ella found refuge at the farmhouse, and so much had changed. Sophie had slowly rebuilt her life, finding strength in helping others and sharing her story. She had written a book, The Day I Chose to Live, a testament to her journey from fear to freedom. It was a raw, honest account of her escape from abuse, the darkness she had endured, and the hope she had found. The book had started to gain attention, especially within survivor communities, and Sophie had been invited to speak at an event to share her journey. As she stood at the podium, her heart racing, she felt a sense of pride in how far she had come. She was no longer the broken woman who had fled in the night. She was someone who had found her voice, someone who had reclaimed her power. As the crowd listened attentively, Sophie spoke with conviction, her words steady and clear, not just for herself, but for all the women who still needed hope. And then, as she finished her speech, there was a pause. The moderator stepped forward, clearing his throat. "We have one more surprise guest speaker," he said, as Sophie's eyes widened in surprise. James walked down the aisle, his hands tucked in the pockets of his coat. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as their eyes met. James stepped up to the stage, his voice steady as he began to speak. He revealed his past, how he had once been the CEO of a successful company, but had walked away from it all after the tragic death of his sister Sophie. Listened in silence, her heart swelling with understanding. As James spoke, it became clear that they both shared more than just their pain. They had found something in each other that could heal those old wounds. After the event, Sophie and James found themselves reconnecting in a way they hadn't before. They began to spend more time together, and gradually Sophie realized that she was no longer alone. She had found not just a friend, but someone who understood her completely. As they sat together talking and laughing, Sophie realized that the future, once so uncertain, now held the promise of something even more beautiful. A new beginning, not just for herself, but for them both. This story conveys several important messages that can deeply resonate with anyone, especially those over 35 who may have experienced their own struggles or setbacks. First, it highlights the power of resilience and the human ability to rebuild life even after facing overwhelming challenges. Sophie's journey from abuse to healing emphasizes that choosing to leave an unhealthy situation is an act of strength, not weakness. It reminds us that despite the scars of the past, we have the power to choose our future. Second, the story teaches the value of compassion and human connection. James's quiet understanding and willingness to offer Sophie and Ella shelter exemplifies the importance of being kind to others, even strangers, and providing support when it's needed most. Finally, Sophie's eventual growth and her decision to share her story with others underline the importance of giving back and supporting those who are going through similar struggles. The message is clear: by helping others, we help ourselves heal. For anyone feeling trapped or uncertain, this story encourages the belief that change is possible and that reaching out for help and offering it in return can lead to profound transformation.